Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on this very, very spectacular day for us. Yeah, maybe just to start this a little bit. So the term digital occultism is something that we came up with about 2.5 years ago and have since then been working steadily on different instantiations, and including like teaching a seminar, holding a couple of lectures, all kinds of things. And then it all came together in this book that we're truly grateful for being able to publish with Aksioma. And so for today, we've prepared a presentation that is a little bit freestyling, free-flowing, to kind of match the vibe, how this all came into being. And we will not take away the fun of you actually going and reading the book, but basically not follow the exact same structure, but just give a little bit of like insights every now and then, drop some anecdotes, and hope you're gonna get interested in what the hell digital occultism is supposed to mean. So thank you for being here, and let's get into it.
I'm pretty sure that a lot of you have seen this one, because I think for the mainstream, this is really one of the high points when digital occultism actually happened in the mainstream. And this is Tucker Carlson, probably one of the biggest podcasters in the US on the reactionary right, showing the numerogram from the CCRU, which is probably one of the formative collectives that actually combined theory and occult literature, knowledge, and cybernetic theory. And Tucker decided, like, let's talk about this. Let's absolutely show this to millions of people and hope that they can actually follow. Did they follow? We don't know. They ended up doing a lot of different things in here, but what really did resonate, I think, is that all of a sudden, people became very aware that there was an entanglement between the ideas of esoteric knowledge, theory, philosophy, and especially contemporary politics.
And a big relation to beef tallow as well, to anyone who has seen the podcast episode. In our next example, that is also basically has been, you were unable to miss out on that over the last year, is from this great lecture series on the Antichrist held by Peter Thiel, which was now, I think, done twice in the US. And like one time, was it in Rome or Vatican City even, where he wanted to talk about this. And of course, this was all top secret. So you had to be invited, you had to be there. And like access was very limited, where we also see, a parallel to traditional esoteric movements. But then what is exactly the Antichrist for a tech mogul like Peter Thiel? Well, of course, it's, trying to regulate AI and denying, the AI god to actually rise and take over the world by the means of, Thiel's politics. And I think this collage also happens to be a very strong, a Jesus reference as well. So we can see here how the Antichrist basically would be having a critical attitude towards AI while praising, our Lord and Savior Peter Thiel is basically how to be rescued on Judgment Day.
What it of course also shows us is especially how in the US there's become an entanglement between an esoteric side of religious knowledge and hegemonic power. And especially how all of this centers around a very certain group of people, which we'll return to later in the presentation, and how somebody like J.D. Vance, probably like a very well-known character at this point, actually has these entanglements, and like how he's interacting with religion and the narratives that come out of that, and how they then shape the reality that we're all participating in.
Bringing us to a last silhouette before diving into digital occultism. Probably you've also heard about this. It dropped last week, I think. There was a heavy increase in the output and in the dialogue of ChatGPT mentioning fantasy creatures such as goblins and gremlins, I think, in particular. So you can see here how much there was a spike suddenly, and whatever you were talking to ChatGPT about, it would give you back a reference to goblins or some other mythical creatures. And of course, OpenAI researchers were also like, where's this coming from? And I think the standing theory here is that it was fed with a lot of like fantasy literature, nerd literature, however you want to call it, which then of course leads to this kind of overrepresentation also in the output data. But again, we see a move towards like the mythical and like the lore, basically, that we just think like is very much in tune with what we are trying to frame here.
Yeah, maybe we'll end up seeing a lot of academic articles in not too long that all reference goblins. Yeah, so this is a reference to the book, because what might be worthwhile is starting a little bit historically, taking a step back and saying, one of the primary things that when we were going over this, we realized is that basically every time we have a major shift in technology, we also have a return to magical thinking. Basically, we have to try and understand what it is that's happening through technologies. Technologies allow us to do something that otherwise we were not able to do before. We see this, what we really found like useful to talk about at least, is especially how this changed with telecommunications. Going back to something like the telegraph. Because it started being entangled with esoteric movements such as the spiritualist movement, which really equated the idea of this communication over distance with what you could also imagine being a communication with the netherworld, with, through the ether, basically. And not just in a way where it was like an image, but an actual thing that was engaged with and shaped how these movements functioned. Going back to, like very well-known researchers, scientists that were also peripherally relevant to the spiritualist movement, starting to think about like, okay, how can these technologies actually relate to, more religious knowledge, more esoteric ideas, and especially something like the necrophone, like the idea that you could actually speak with the dead through these technologies. Of course, like once we started having something like television, radio, all of a sudden, like this changed even more because now it was a mass medium. And we had plenty of cases of dilution, of people engaging with these media as something that was truly speaking to them from another realm, right? And bringing us to kind of what we're doing now through cyberspace. That like really gave us this idea of, like meat space and cyberspace being some kind of like dualist idea, something that was different from each other, but at the same time connected through this thread of technology.
I mean, everyone has probably had the thought that how come the platform is showing me something, recommending me something that I just thought about 5 minutes ago? I didn't even say it out loud. How does it know? And while doing so, we are actually pushing some kind of agency onto the recommendation algorithm in that case, because we cannot explain it to ourselves how it does that. Does it like survey us? Does it listen to our conversations? Does it hack into our search history via Wi-Fi network or whatever? But there seems to be some kind of creature, some kind of meaning that has to be behind these coincidences that happen all the time. And this, of course, then also gets exploited specifically by creators. For my favorite example that I always bring is on tarot TikTok, where you then have a video popping up on your feed basically going, oh, this video has no hashtags, it has no like words in it, no caption. If it found you, it is meant for you. So there's this kind of, delusion actually that something could have been made for you by the computer, by the platform, by the software in order to intervene in your actual life.
Yeah. But before we jump into this next part, what really becomes clear in this, and especially once we start engaging with mass media, is the way that these narratives become operative in reality. Like they start actually shaping the way that we're thinking about what these technologies do, and also how their engagement in reality goes and changes how we're engaging with that reality. Basically, having something like the idea of cyberspace being pushed in and actually going in and shaping the way that we then also later start to shape the technology. Like the idea that it was posited as a narrative around what technology does through science fiction, but it ended up being how we then started to build the internet. It started to affect how we think about artificial intelligence. And that is really like the primary thing that we saw through all of this, is it shaped reality. And that's really the important crux of this.
And also, just to give another illustration to that, we've probably all experienced that you were, I don't know, talking to your friend about something and they mention, oh, have you heard this and that news story? And you basically have never encountered that because you're just in different bubbles. You're in different echo chambers that seem to be impossible to traverse through. And this is exactly the kind of reality production that we're trying to talk about with this book, is that we each get like assigned to our own little form of reality, cubicle, or however you want to call it. And it's about finding how they're actually connected. So that is kind of this mission of how we're looking at the certain fictions that shaped that and then ultimately became real through our engagement and our presence online. Oh. So do you want to give a backstory on the Psyops?
I can do a little bit of that. Yeah, we can start with this guy. That follows a little bit, again, what we're doing in the book. This is U.S. Army Major Mikkel Rørbo. And he's actually quite useful as a little anecdotal character for us because he illustrates this entanglement between the occult on one side and hegemonic power on the other. As I mentioned, U.S. Army Major who wrote a book called Mind War. He was part of basically their Psyops unit in the U.S. Army, positing how they could change sentiments, how you could basically win a war without ever having to do anything except make people think that you're going to win this war. What he also was that he was the founder of the Temple of Set, which was an offshoot from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. Very real connection here between these two things. At first, you would think like, okay, how the hell did this guy end up in the US Army? But once you start thinking about, again, the idea that in occultism, there's always been this idea that you can change reality. And put a guy like this in charge of a PSYOP unit, and you've got some really useful ideas. And the quote that we see here is one of the main ideas that was posited in Mind War.
Yes. So as you can see, it really is not so much about giving you another form of reality, another explanation of that, but destroying that belief in reality itself. So actually making it impossible to have a coherent feeling or a coherent grasp of what is actually real. Because once your belief in what is around you becomes that fragmented, you can believe in anything. And oftentimes, this is also likened to what François Lyotard called the postmodern condition, just to have a little bit of a theory excursus as well, where basically Lyotard was talking about the breakdown of what was known as grand narratives. So like the grand narratives of history, such as the emergence of nation states or, the myth of the second coming of Christ or, kind of big narratives that actually function to structure reality in a way that is like comprehensible, is like foreseeable. And this kind of breaks down a little bit during the postmodern period, according to Lyotard, which then allows a lot of like small narratives to arise, which we then see again echoed in something like the psychological operations of the CIA that were, done by Aquino, and basically having the category of truth lose its significance at all. So once there is no more value to truth itself, it's easy to believe anything.
Yeah, and this of course can be weaponized. Like that's really also what we end up seeing in contemporary instantiations of this, is that not only is it just a condition that happens, it's something that is weaponized and utilized actively by certain actors to push a certain reality. And what we kind of realized while going through this is that we could see these moves utilized through a whole bunch of different movements, different users, platforms, companies, corporations. It became like a very big web of different scales that were all kind of engaging in the same method or same kinds of ideas of how you could shape realities. So one thing is like calling it cyber war. Of course, we're being a little bit creative with it here. It's like, it's not just war in the masculinist sense of that. It is really about like the operationalization of these kinds of tool sets.
And of course, now in the age of like fake news or whatever, the post-truth condition, whatever we want to call it nowadays, psyops and conspiracies have become super mainstream. So we've seen this, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also seeing this with like any piece of news that makes it, basically. But as soon as there's something out there, there's also a conspiracy to why it happened like this. And this kind of became also the standard mode of engaging with digital cultures at this point. For example, through a method that has been called, or a style of writing that has been called schizoposting, which basically simulates, a mental breakdown and brings together a bunch of fragments of meaning to have a very disorienting kind of posting. So we can see that it's kind of, related to shit posting in the classical sense, which is just post-ironic bullshitting online, basically. But like schizoposting is still a little bit more insane than that, so to say. So that is why we have, of course, the cat here, because this is literally what like going online feels like nowadays. But this, of course, can also be treated in a different way, as we can see in the image on the right.
This particular graphic is something that, again, goes back historically a little bit, but now that we're talking about schizoposting, actually is quite relevant. It harkens back to a movement that was called Discordianism, came out of the counterculture movement in the 60s, and basically made, arguably, schizoposting into a form of publishing, of infiltrating certain ideas, because it was about just worshiping chaos. It started as a joke religion that was worshiping Eris, the idea, like the goddess of chaos, and just flooding as much bullshit and as many fake ideas as possible, to kind of undermine the idea of what religion is, what politics are, what even a narrative is, to the extent that at some point it actually became a recognized religion, impressively enough. But what it also did was show us how these ideas can be in a huge variety of different media, because the involved people were both political activists, they were, jesters, basically. They were writers. For example, the Illuminatus trilogy of science fiction books actively played with ideas from Discordianism. And it also kind of laid the groundwork for what we're now knowing as trolling, online trolling, and really informed something like the anonymous movement that came much later and is utterly unrelated in its pure ideas, but its form and its way of engaging with narrative is very much informed by this idea from the counterculture movement.
So what we're really trying to trace in the book is this kind of mechanism, how it came into being, and that you can use psyops like for both, let's say the evil state-controlled conspiracy MK Ultra program, as 𝘋𝘪𝘨𝘵𝘮 did, but you could also use it as a like self-made movement that basically just tries to bring chaos into the world, for better or for worse. But what is really important here is that there is not necessarily any good or bad intention behind it in the method itself. So this is kind of the takeaway from the Psyops. And today, of course, we can see that like Psyops have turned into artistic practices, for example, where you have online movements that basically just work through trolling and through creation of online cults and basically trying to psyop mainstream audiences of whatever platform they're on according to their beliefs. So yeah, so basically this is then our bridge on how we get into the digital territory, and what we then have the meme magic, of course.
Yeah, and also as a little bit of a segue between what we were just talking about in this, is also that it's important perhaps that we point out that there is this little middle part where magic becomes magic with a CK, and we add chaos in front of it. So chaos magic becomes really formative in the way that esoteric knowledge is kind of, or occultism is engaged with in that sector. Like where before it was very much about hermetic knowledge, it was about closed cults. It was like something that was for only the initiated. But suddenly there's a switch in how we can engage with occultism and magic, which is much more open to the individual practitioner. They can engage with it however they want, through whatever medium they want. It becomes about how their desires can change what reality is constituted of, and especially how it relates to themselves as individuals. And to call it a democratization of occult knowledge is maybe taking a little bit far, because it still takes some work, but it does really change how it can become engaged with in different kinds of platforms, because of course this also coincided with utilization of mass media, and especially became very popular on online message boards, and instantiated through, for example, with the meme sigil.
So we're tracing a little bit also a small, micro history of the meme, the classical internet meme of today, as related to the sigil, the classic esoteric form of encoded desire. For example, you probably all know the sigil at Baphomet, which is the pentagram, which is basically a sigil for Lucifer. But any kind of like really condensed small form. You could even bend it a little bit and say maybe something like a logo. But what is really important about the sigil is that it is always like following a certain desire of a practitioner. So,
but yeah, and that's maybe also where this chaos magic sigilization changes a little bit from something like the sigil of Baphomet, or we got lots of questions about the Lesser Key of Solomon in our class, which is also a classic sigil. But what really became important for us and how we were trying to deal with this, and also how it exactly deals with desire in this libidinal economy type of way, again referencing Lyotard, is like how it can become encoded into popular culture and also shape that reality through these desires. We were drawing on, again, a classic like Austin Osman Spare, which was a practitioner in the early 1900s who basically gave shape to what modern sigil magic is, which was very much about make a visual form encoded with your ideas. In his case, he basically said, write it out, take the shapes of these letters, put them together, remove duplicates, and now forget about it. This will allow you to then have this visual representation. It'll do something in the world. Memes kind of do that too.
Like fast forward a couple of decades, and maybe some of you remember the CULTUS. I love bringing this example. Everyone keeps on laughing about, at me for that. But like the CULTUS, which is a couple of lines that was like, for whatever reason, drawn by lots of like students in school. We don't know where it comes from. We don't know what it's actually supposed to mean, except that it's cool, you know. But somehow there's like this like urge, this like desire to circulate it. And that seems to be a kind of bridge then between basically esoteric sigils and memes of today. Because what esoteric groups and memes or meme-ecologies also share is a strong emphasis on in-group and out-group. So in-group basically just means everyone who is like in the know about, for example, the meaning of a certain sigil. And that was, of course, how esoteric movements have been operating for the longest time. Because in order to be part of an esoteric movement, you had to join them, you had to be initiated, you had to learn all of the forbidden knowledge and really like dive deep into it. There could be no wannabes and fakers in there. There was a strong separation bias. And with memes, we have basically the same thing, because a meme you can only really decipher when you know about the meaning, when you know about the references. Otherwise, it's just an image to you. And of course, through being online and through the internet and through its like, you know, double-edged sword democratization, this suddenly becomes more accessible, which also makes it easier then to continue to circulate it.
Because one thing is that you have the in-group, out-group dynamic. Some people know what a sigil means, but whether they know or not, they can still engage and circulate it regardless. One example of that is here on the, all the way on the left side, the linking sigil, the Ellis, which is fundamentally like a idea that was come up with by an actual occult group, that's called the DKMU, the Domus Chaotica Marauder Underground, which was like a grouping of very, very online, very meme-happy occultists. They came up with this sigil, which fundamentally is just about making everything weirder. It links things together, and once you see it, you start thinking that things are connected to each other. It could use, you know, in a magical working, it would, you know, make things more empowered. But what this is an example of is how something like a meme can actually be engaged with regardless of whether you understand it or not. Because just the fact that you're seeing it shapes the way that you're perceiving of your context or your bubble. It can also, just the fact that you like a certain thing on a platform, whether you understand it or not, all of a sudden can catapult you in a totally different direction. All of a sudden, you know, this becomes an actual assault on your reality, as they were talking about. It makes everything weirder. It undermines what was before like the rigid, stable reality that you were relating to.
In the middle, we also see the emoji sigil project by the graphic design studio 914NY. And basically, this is a drawing on the formal relations between the sigils of the Lesser Key of Solomon, or the Ars Goetia, as were already mentioned, and the basic design of emojis today. So basically taking this idea again of some simple drawing that has a very distinct meaning, in this case, you know, the laugh crying emoji, and how it might encode like have a certain form of meaning and intended desire in it that basically then just proliferates into what was now called like an emoji demon or something. Makes it sound very, very much more obscure than maybe it actually is, but it is a fun side project that also then went very viral. But I think to really follow up on the logic of memes as sigils, we of course are also talking about the cult of 𝘋𝘪, which is basically a kind of belief, I don't want to say religion, but like spiritual movement that formed out of the Pepe the Frog meme. So as you may know, Pepe the Frog was actually a pretty harmless meme of a harmless origin in some comic of a Californian artist, but then became very, very popular in certain corners on the image board 4chan, and was basically at some point then used very much in a hateful context. So there are a lot of like, you know, negative stereotypes with Pepe. There are a lot of like, was used to really proliferate hate, to proliferate racism and misogyny, and also to became kind of a stand-in for the whole MAGA movement. So this was back in 2015, 2016. Around that time, we're shortly before the US-American presidential elections. And the cult of 𝘋 formed then on 4chan's politically incorrect board to kind of push for the presidential win of Donald Trump. And what happened from there on is that they just collected like mythologies. You have to imagine it as a kind of bottom-up creation of lore where Trump basically was like becoming synonymous with Pepe the Frog, would bring, some kind of salvation and, lots of like very odd, like negative things that we don't want to go into full detail in this presentation, but you can find it in a book about like why, Trump has to win. And of course, once Trump then won, it was seen as a self-fulfilling prophecy that was brought by Pepe, or more specifically in the cult of 𝘋.
Which, of course, also points out this combination of what is called conspirituality. So conspirational theories and spirituality really came together in that figure of 𝘋. And really shows again like how these narratives that are, and I mean we all know this at this point, that conspirational theory really has become a formative tool in how politics are shaped at this point.
Another example of this period in particular, which also like very, very much referenced esoteric methods, were the QAnon drops, for example. So they were really like posted as these like cryptic messages from this like apparent, Q-coded security officer of the NSA or whatever they were like, being the Lulu about, but basically they were like treated as prophecies by people, supporting the MAGA movement, and also like decoded really as these like esoteric messages from somewhere that had to be understood and had some kind of prophecy element to the actual MAGA movement. For example, its unification by 2017. So that was also very much then, of course, pushed by the MAGA movement itself, already showing that there is this kind of blurring between the things, that are promised as prophecies and actual like support of people in power, of politicians, of people with lots of influence, pushing for this kind of occult knowledge and prophecy character. Yeah.
And using that very actively to shape their politics, of course. And I mean, at this point, it's also interesting, of course, that we have a lot of conspirational theory that has come true. It's just that it's in the other direction. They kept talking about it being the left that was doing it, but maybe it's not so much the case.
Yeah. In any case, this all then comes together in our definition of digital occultism. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. So this is a quote from the book. Digital occultism is an epistemological framework native to contemporary technosocial conditions wherein occult language and esoteric imaginaries seem to have become the most adequate descriptors for the conspiratorial politics, aestheticized networks, and technological assemblages we find ourselves embedded within. Or quite frankly, why everything has become so fucking weird. And that also harkens again back to that point that Sophie was making about it. It's ambiguous. Like, what we really try to develop here is a way to kind of understand the languages and vocabularies that are being actively used here to shape our reality. It's not so much about saying like, this is only done by the right or the left, or how is it supposed to be done as an emancipatory tool set, but really saying like, this is something that we need to be able to understand to actually engage with technological progression, but also the conditions under which power is being enacted through technologies and through the platforms that we're actively using today.
As we can see, for example, to also return to our examples from the beginning, by all the things that are coming out of the Silicon Valley and of people like, Alex Carr, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman in particular. And here we brought just a screenshot from the Palantir manifesto that was also just posted last week. That has a couple of like clauses in like very specific understandings of where technological policy and politics are supposedly heading according to Palantir.
And what we found fascinating about this is, of course, that this is about building myth, right? It's about creating some kind of lore that can shape how you talk about the world. And in their case, also how you can then shape sentiment. Because Palantir is very actively engaged in changing sentiment. Because if you're just a military-industrial complex actor, that doesn't really work with the general populace. You're too siloed away. So what they've been very actively engaged in is basically building a lifestyle cult. In their own words, like they're willing to say that this is what they're doing. It's about basically combating wokeness. And that is a very active tool for them through these narratives, such as The Technological Republic, which is a book that basically pulls on the idea of the network state. It's about near-reaction. It's about tech CEO monarchy, basically. But you can't just argue about these kinds of things without having laid the groundwork before. You can't just come out and say this without any kind of grounding in how politics have been shaped in recent years. And in this case, that really came to be through the combination of what has become known as the TESCREAL bundle. Now, we really should have written down all the names, but like TESCREAL is basically a abbreviation for certain ideas in the Silicon Valley elite for transhumanism, singularitarianism, cosmism, effective altruism. Now I'm trying to remember all of them. Long-termism, actually. And so basically like a whole bundle of ideas that have to do with where humanity is supposed to go, but also how, in the case of something like transhumanism, how humanity is supposed to give up on actually being human and go and be something else entirely. These ideas are having a surprisingly big grip on American policy because of these influential characters, such as, for example, Peter Thiel, having direct access to the elite that is in the political side of things, not just in the rich billionaire doing insane shit side of things. And what we've also seen here is, and that's what we're trying to also get to in the book, is a surprising connection with theory, actually. Very niche theory even at that, which is exemplified by something like, for example, near-reaction, which is the idea that we can build a hyper-racist society of tiny little techno-states that are each governed by their own little tech CEO, and we can all move around between them as we see fit, if we're just privileged enough, of course. And this is actually having traction. And what that is also doing, of course, then, is changing slowly, inch by inch, the sentiment of the public, both in the US, but through ties with, for example, the UK government, also here in Europe.
So what we're basically, to sum it all up, are trying to say is that next time you encounter magic online, don't just believe that it's magic, but it's actually belief grounded in material reality. And how we also want to end on this is, of course, that the question is no longer whether magic itself is real, but the question is how it is being used, by whom, and towards what ends. Yes. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you have any more questions, we're looking forward to the Q&A. And thank you again for being here.